Welcome to TechZine TV.
Welcome to this new video at KubeCon and Cloud Native Con, and we're now talking to Madeline Olsen, who's Principal Software Engineer at Amazon. But we're not here to talk about Amazon, we're here to talk about Valkey, one of the projects, open source projects you were a founder of, I believe, or one of the founders.
Yes, I was one of the original people that created the fork of Valkey, which was originally based off the Redis open source project, which I was previously a maintainer of.
Mhm.
And when Redis decided they wanted a different license that wasn't open source, me and a couple of collaborators from the Redis open source project got together and we created Valkey.
Okay. And now it's back to the open source license. Does that change your perspective on the project, or?
Well, that's pretty interesting. So Redis was originally a BSD, which is a very permissive license.
Mhm.
They moved to a dual license, which was two proprietary license effectively.
Yeah.
And now they're back at AGPL, which is a more restrictive open source license, but open source nonetheless.
Yeah.
But two things haven't changed. One, before the fork, there was 5 maintainers of the Redis open source project, of which 2 did not work at the company, Redis Limited. So there was me and an engineer named Zhao who worked at Alibaba. So we were sort of the outside maintainers. Since they've moved back to AGPL, Redis has not reinstated sort of an open governance. So it's still pretty much a single vendor, single company driving the project. In addition, they still have a CLA. So basically, if they wanted to change the license again, they could. So until we basically kind of see like a vibrant open community back around Redis, we're going to keep driving the Valkey project because that's what we care about. We want it to be community driven. We want it to be open source forever, which is part of the reason we're in the Linux Foundation. The Linux Foundation helps us keep that open governance for the long term.
And you mentioned a Chinese man from Alibaba. Is
Yeah.
he also in part of the Valkey project?
Yeah. So Valkey was originally founded by 6 individuals from 6 companies. So there was Zhao, who was from Alibaba. We have an engineer named Bin, who was from Tencent. We have an engineer from Ericsson named Victor. We have an engineer from Huawei named Lucas. And then we also had an engineer from Google named Ping. So as well as me, myself. So that's 6 companies, a nice broad range of, some telecom, quite a bit of cloud providers. Since then, we've had more individuals like folks from Percona have also started to work on helping maintain the project. So a nice diverse group of folks.
How do you get together from different companies? Sorry, Eric.
No, no, it's
What force coalesces you? Because how do you find each other?
So we originally found each other primarily because we worked together in Redis open source. One of the things that I did in the Redis open source community was I started a Slack, and we basically created like weekly meetings where we'd all get together. It's actually very hard to get all of those time zones together in one room. Either someone's waking up very early or someone's staying up very late. But it's very important to us. We meet weekly. The meeting's actually fully open. A lot of people actually enjoy kind of just like dropping in and listening to us chat about, whatever. We had a meeting this last week about some of the hard questions about, minor performance trade-offs versus memory efficiency trade-offs, which are important conversations for our community. And yeah, we just...
So I'm interested in sort of the trajectory you take with a project that is a fork of something else that, because of the response to it, appears to have gone a little bit back to their roots. Do you ever look at the roadmap of your competing service and think those ideas are something we should adopt, or these are things that we've become sort of incompatible with because of how we've opted to choose our trajectory?
Right. And so our goal is very much to make Valkey not just a fork of Redis.
Yeah.
Our goal was to drive, a community-driven, independent project based on what our users needed. So initially, a lot of our initial roadmap was based off of features that we wanted to contribute to Redis open source, but were unable to because of some of the dynamics within Redis. Right. One thing I talk about a lot is Amazon, my employer, was trying to build a observability feature to basically find like heat issues within a cluster. So Valkey has a horizontal distribution mode called Valkey Cluster, and within those there's units of shards called slots. And so basically we wanted to build observability to figure out which of these were the hottest slots in a cluster. So when we did rebalancing, we could like figure out where all those went. So we wanted to upstream this work to Redis open source. We got initial buy-in, and they basically at some point just said, no, we're not accepting this feature. Go do it yourself. So Amazon actually kept it as an internal commit on our internal fork of the Redis open source project. And so when we were able to create Valkey, we drove it completely in the open. And so we were able to basically take that patch and merge it more or less as is, with some community engagement. And so those are the types of things we're trying to build in the community.
Yeah.
So overall, the Valkey project sort of has like 5 pillars for what we're trying to do. We're trying to build it so it's fast. That's what in-memory databases are known for. We also want to make sure it's very memory efficient. We want to minimize the amount of DRAM used to store data.
Yeah.
We want to improve the observability, which was like that slot statistics I was talking about. We want to make sure it's very reliable. That's something AWS cares a lot about. We want to make sure our customers aren't seeing downtime. And then lastly, very easy to use. So Redis open source became very popular because of all the flexible, interesting data structures.
Right.
So we're trying to, keep that ethos alive within Valkey to make it easy to use and build
Right.
excellent high performance applications on top of.
Are you still compatible with Redis?
So what you mean by compatible is a very interesting question. So
Yeah. If one wants to move from one to the other.
So the core protocol between the two is still the same. It's called REST.
Mm-hmm.
So both applications still support the same protocol. If you are using Redis open source and only using commands from Redis 7, open source 7.2 or earlier, Valkey is still fully API compatible. You can take your application, drop it inside Valkey, and it will work as is. So that's when the fork happens. So after that point, it becomes a little bit more interesting. So you do have to do a little bit of asking the question like, we have both independently built APIs that have actually converged together. So the slot statistics I talked about that Redis rejected, they actually later merged back into Redis, the post Redis BSD versions. So there are some APIs which have grown independently and then remerged back together.
Does Redis take your open source code to add to their project then?
They do and they can, right? So we are
And the other way
BSD.
around?
We can't take their commits because they're AGPL. AGPL is incompatible with BSD, but BSD is
Okay.
compatible with AGPL.
Okay.
And, that's the great part about open source. We're able to innovate the way we want. And if they want to take it, that's how open source works.
Yeah, but I can see that some contributors might find that not pleasant, let's call it that. If you now work on a Valkey project because they were creating a license issue and now they take the code to put in that project again.
That's how open source works.
Okay. But there's never a discussion internally about or feelings being exposed like we don't appreciate this
No,
that much.
for the most part, people are still just excited to have a vibrant open source community. And it's not like Redis takes all of our commits.
Okay.
Redis, well, they're picky about them. And we had some conversations about maybe picking a different licensing option. But one of the feedback we got initially is people, like license continuity. They like to know, they don't want to think about it. They don't want to engage the lawyers. Like, even if it could work for their application, nobody wants to go have that conversation. So just keeping the same license is important. And so far, it's worked out pretty well for us.
So an interesting part of what you mentioned is the focus on performance and
Yes.
the as little amount of DRAM as you can muster, which is especially useful with the ongoing DRAM shortage. But one issue with AI right now is that the push for efficiency is very truncated and very partial.
Mhm.
There are many vibe coders who will never even think about memory allocation,
Right.
for example, and or bandwidth, or there will be intense bottlenecks in their AI stacks
Mhm.
when it comes to memory or to storage, you name it. So what kind of role can open source play to expand that beyond just the database, which is obviously a huge part of the whole story, to make AI workloads run efficiently and use as little hardware as possible?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I'll first answer the question kind of in the context of Valkey,
Right.
right? We want, open standards are very important, right? So if we all come together and agree on a specific standard, then we can all go and independently go figure out how do we optimize the implementation of that standard to maximize memory efficiency and performance. And that's what we've been trying to do in Valkey, right? There's a part of the inference stack called KV caching to, improve the performance of inference. And if you were to use Valkey as the KV backend for that, it would be more memory efficient than some of the older versions of Redis. And our goal with that is it's a drop-in replacement because it's using an open API standard. And it's also faster, right? We've been making a lot of performance improvements over time.
Right.
So that's one of the main benefits of open source is, as long as we're all aligned on these open standards and they make sense and they're extensible, we can basically swap out the underlying implementation for something that's more memory efficient and more performant.
Right.
And, that's one of my hopes, with LLMs, there's this big open question of, a lot of vibe coders will just let the LLM make a choice. And as long as the LLMs are kind of picking and consolidating on these open standards, then it becomes easier to go and layer to be like, hey, let's optimize this specific thing. And since it's a drop-in replacement, because it's using an open API, they can move to something more efficient without, outages, reliability issues, or all of that.
And so one interesting part about specifically to do with open source and LLMs is that the definition of open source for LLMs is kind of, let's say, friendly to the model makers, where open weight effectively is considered open source, where we don't know the data that's been trained, etc.
Right.
Is there any issue there with regard to trying to stick to some kind of, let's say, purity or some kind of dogma around what open source should be, or is it just you have to roll with the punches, and this is how LLMs have developed?
I don't think we necessarily have to roll with the punches. One of the things I was kind of talking about with like the open standards, and I think the way I think about where we think we see models going to, right? Like right now they're all kind of privatized behind APIs. One of the things I do like is so in my day-to-day I use Kiro primarily, and Kiro allows you to basically select which foundational model you're using to build with, and if OpenAI releases a new model, I can go easily switch and I can go test it. And that's because we're all still building on top of standards. And, they might not be fully open. I kind of expect someday they will start moving in that direction. And it's also quite easy to swap in open source models as well. Like we've talked about DeepSeek, which, I guess I feel about, I just said open source, but it's more of open weights, which is what we were just talking about. We did kind of, I wish we hadn't lost that fight, but I kind of agree with you. Part of the open source ethos was, you can investigate, you can understand it, you can learn from it, which is you can't really do with the open weights. But I think, with inference, it's pretty easy to move between the models. And so I think that still fills a similar role to the open standards we were talking about. And I'm, still hopeful that at some point we'll have more of an open standard for, how this will all work.
Yeah.
I read somewhere you're making Valkey more relevant for AI workflows by adopting vector similarity search. I'm wondering how your vector search is different from all the others, because there's so many out there now.
Yeah.
And I didn't see the vector search in the
So Valkey's had vector search for a while. We actually launched it almost a year ago. I think we launched at the last open source summit in North America.
Okay.
And the way I think about vector similarity search is there's kind of the quite slow side. I'm going to use S3 vectors as what I'm used to, which tend to be quite slow. Tail latency is hundreds of milliseconds. Useful for you have a lot of data, a lot of vectors, and you want something, but it's like, it's async, it doesn't matter. Then there's some of the more real-time stuff like OpenSearch or stuff like pgvector, open source databases that have vector similarity search. They still tend to have some tail latency because some stuff is stored on disk. They're not as good if you kind of need very real time. Like I know time to first token is a very important aspect of a lot of, user experience when they're engaging with agents. And so I think Valkey kind of fits that very far end. Like if you kind of took one more further step, since we keep the entire vector set in memory, HNSW, the common vector similarity approximate nearest neighbor implementation, lends itself quite well to it all being in memory, because there's a lot of random lookups to sort of traverse these graphs. So we're able to basically do a very high coverage search with high recall of all the possible vectors and return still relatively quickly. So for workloads where you need very high recall and very low latency, which is common stuff, where you're a user interacting with the agent, you want to inject that extra context to the LLM call very quickly to get the first token as quickly as possible. That's the places you'll be using with Valkey. And one other benefit that we see a lot, so sort of to make an extension from how Valkey is used today, which is primarily a cache, you can do something similar with, you can basically cache a smaller subset of the vectors while keeping the much larger set on the slower mediums like disk. And so you're still kind of doing something similar to database caching. So you can inject some of the context, and then you can get the time to first token down a bit because you can do the faster call with stuff like semantic search or semantic caching, and then still wait on that slower result. So you're giving the user, oh, hey, here's something that might be related, might not be exactly what you want, while you're still waiting on the slower LLM calls. So there's, some similar places we can compare to traditional caching, which, in memory, high performance, still makes sense.
Yeah, my next question would have been, isn't that expensive? But you already answered that by putting a smaller.
Yeah, a smaller one.
Yeah. Okay.
So, Matt, just looking to the future as you continue the project, when you need to increase an attribute, you listed very competently about 7 things, observability, performance, all those things. When you want to build more, will you always? I mean, and you also talked very openly about like kind of the open source ethos. Will you always look to the community? Will you look for other, for open integrations, or will you look to you all work for these large enterprise vendors, some of which might contribute, or will you build from scratch, or what will you do?
I mean, we're definitely going to take a very pragmatic approach. So back when Redis was, it was open source, but more of a closed development ecosystem because they weren't accepting stuff. Amazon Lastcache built quite a bit of proprietary tech. And we're actually very interested in contributing a lot of this work back to open source. But we're also aware that some of the stuff that we build isn't exactly what either the community wants, or like one of my favorite stories is with the performance stuff. So we built this feature called IO threading, right? Basically offloading IO work to background threads to improve vertical scalability, include total performance. What we built inside Elasticache, we didn't really like. It worked, like it did what it did, but it was 15,000 lines of C++ code. And what we basically did was we took the learnings from that and we were able to contribute it as a much simpler form factor, only like 1,500 lines of C code. So, it's kind of a combination of, what makes sense. We took the learnings from the big enterprises. We obviously want as many, contributors involved as well, because they bring a different perspective. Like, and again, like Amazon Lastcache is not the only provider of, in-memory caching services.
Right.
We love leaning on our partners like GCP and Alibaba and Tencent and Ericsson. Like those, they also bring a very unique perspective as well, something that we might not see. So the reality is like all three, right? We want to take what we got, we want to make sure the community is being deeply involved, and then we do, engineers love building stuff, so we're going to always keep building things.
Great. Madeline, thank you for being on our show. Our time is up, unfortunately.
Went by so fast.
Yeah, it went so fast. Thank you for being here. Maybe we'll meet again and do another episode on developments at Amazon or Valkey or whatever it might bring.
All of those sound great. I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching TechZine TV, the channel about enterprise technology that brings you IT insights and analyses from events all around the globe. We cover everything, everywhere. Visit techzine.eu for more written in-depth articles and analysis, or keep watching techzine.tv. Don't forget to subscribe to our channels and share your favorite videos with your colleagues. We'll see you soon.